YouTube. So I see a little window has popped up, Roland, that says the meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. Is that accurate?
Even after that says that, it's still actually got a few more seconds before it finishes, but you're ready to go now.
Okay.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Norwalk Board of Education Finance Committee meeting. Today is Wednesday, February 10th. The time is now 6:06. We're going to table the minutes that we were going to do today, as we don't have enough members to vote on those. And Colin will be joining us shortly as he is in another meeting. We're going to start with the agenda. Number 3, the status update concerning the fiscal year 2021-22 operating and capital budgets. So I am transferring this over to you, Tom.
Okay, I just shared the agenda so that everyone, including the public, can see the agenda. And I think I saw Colin join us. So I think
I just popped in, so thank you. Sorry to be late.
We just started, Colin. So I don't know, now that you're here, I don't know if you want to start with the minutes because you now have enough people for the minutes, or whether you want me to jump into item 3.
You know what? Sure. Why don't we just address the minutes? Does anybody have any changes to the minutes? Any? Do you want to make a motion to approve the minutes from January 13?
I think we had made a motion to table them.
We just did right before you came on.
Yeah.
Can we change that?
All right. So let's address it next time. Tom, go ahead.
Okay, so we will move then to the status update concerning the 2021-22 operating and capital budgets. And I am going to stop sharing the agenda so I can start sharing a presentation. And I did email the members of the committee that presentation just earlier this afternoon, late this afternoon. Let me see. And okay, you guys can see the presentation, I assume?
Good.
Okay, good. So happy to give you a status update. As you're probably well aware, the City Finance Director earlier this week on Monday presented his operating budget recommendations to the Board of Estimate and Taxation. And Tuesday, last night, he presented those recommendations to the Common Council. So I wanted to update the Finance Committee tonight on sort of what those recommendations are, talk a little bit about the budget process so that the members of the board are clear as to what steps. Obviously, the budget process for the city goes on for a number of months. The final budget is actually not adopted until the first Monday in May, and there is involvement by both the Common Council and the Board of Estimate and Taxation. So I want to talk about that process and the opportunities for input into that process. I do want to share some new information that we received from the district health insurance consultant on Monday, which was also confirmed by some information from the State 2.0 partnership plan relative to health insurance costs and the implications on our budget of that new information. I want to report on the CFO, city CFO's budget recommendation, and also then respond to certain aspects of the CFO's budget presentation, which we believe are misleading, or in some cases actually has some inaccurate information that we want to clarify and correct. So that's really the purpose of tonight's session. In terms of the budget status, I think as you're probably aware, that the city CFO has recommended a 2.0% budget increase for next year. And the board, as you know, had requested a 5.6% budget increase that was submitted to the city in January. So there is a pretty wide delta between the request of the board and the amount that has been recommended. Our budget request, I believe, totaled approximately 11 I'm sorry, I don't have the number in front of me, but let me just pull it out. Our budget request was an 11.7% increase, and the increase that the city CFO has recommended at 2%, I believe, is a 4.1% or 4.2 million increase. So it's again a pretty wide delta between 11.7 million and 4.2 million. There are a number of opportunities for public input that are coming up. The City Finance Committee will be holding a public hearing on the operating budget cap on February 18th. And that is certainly an opportunity for representatives and others who are interested in the education budget to comment to the Finance Committee on the budget recommendation. And so that is coming up soon, next week. Just to refresh your memory in case you don't remember, the Common Council, their role in the operating budget is to set an overall cap on combined city and Board of Education spending. And they set that cap then the week after that on the 23rd of February. The budget is then really handed off to the Board of Estimate and Taxation, which conducts a individual department by department review of the operating budget requests from all the city departments as well as from the Board of Education. And the Board of Education is scheduled to meet with the Board of Estimate and Taxation on March 17th. And so that will be our opportunity to explain our budget request and answer any questions that the Board of Estimate may have on our budget request. And that again is scheduled for March 17th. The Board of Estimate then holds a public hearing on the operating budget, which they have scheduled for March 24th. And again, that's an opportunity for members of the public who want to offer their opinion about the budget to the Board of Estimate. They're given an opportunity to do that on the 24th of March. Board of Estimate then is scheduled to set a tentative operating budget according on the schedule they've released on March 31st. And then they set the final operating budget on May 3rd. So those are the key dates that are in the calendar and are coming up. Let me stop just on that last slide and see if there's any questions on the process or the dates or kind of the meetings that are scheduled. Any questions from members of the committee?
I just wanted to add, Tom, that there will be another joint meeting of the finance committees on tomorrow.
Very good point.
Yeah.
And I probably should have put that on this slide. That's an excellent point. There is a joint committee meeting tomorrow night. Absolutely, you're correct. So as I had indicated, we do have some updated information on health insurance. As you'll recall from our original budget submission, health insurance was and still is a major driver of next year's operating budget. And we explained in some detail when we presented our budget the reasons that is the case. And it was a combination of factors that were driving the total amount that we were required to contribute to health insurance. We were expecting, based on the budget projections that we were supplied by the district and city health insurance consultant. We happen to use the same health insurance consultant, it's the Siegel Company. And they had, at that point, they also happened to be the health insurance consultant for the state 2.0 health plan, but they did not have updated claims information with which to develop the state 2.0 partnership projected premium rates for next year. So they based their projections on underlying sort of nationwide health insurance trend information. And they had provided us information that indicated that they were predicting that costs would increase at underlying health costs would increase at a rate of 8% plus another 3.5% increase anticipated for the Fairfield County adjustment factor that the state was phasing in on the state 2.0 health plan. So there was a pretty sizable 11.5% underlying cost trend that the health insurance consultants were recommending. On top of that, as you'll recall, we were drawing down on the final remaining balance in the insurance fund, the Board of Ed Health Insurance Fund, which was drawn down as part of the budget for 2020-21. And that fund is essentially depleted, so there's no balance to draw down further next year. And that was resulting in the need for us to make that up in next year's budget to the tune of about $2.7 million. And then there was also an increase in the total number of employees who are on the health insurance plan and the need to reflect the increase in employee population and the increase in the number of people taking health insurance benefits, which also drove the cost higher. So all told, our health insurance costs were projected to increase at about, or our contribution to the insurance fund was projected to increase at approximately 25%. Now, we did receive good news from the health insurance consultant this week, and that is they've indicated that the rate increase, the preliminary rate increase, again, it's not final until April 1st, but the preliminary rate increase that they provided to us is, rather than 11.5%, it is a 4% rate increase for active employees and a 12% rate increase for retirees. So that is certainly favorable news, because the majority of our expense is attributable to active employees, and only a relatively small portion of the expenses related to retirees. So when you run these numbers through our budget spreadsheet for health insurance, and I've attached to this presentation the calculation of the numbers, both that were in the original budget and in the numbers based on these revised estimates from the health insurance consultant. The impact on the Board of Education budget is that instead of needing to budget $32.5 million for health insurance, we would need to budget $30.5 million. So that represents a savings compared to our original request of $2.1 million. And to sort of put it in context, the Board of Ed health insurance budget is still increasing, even with these more favorable, this more favorable rate increase. The Board of Ed budget still needs to go up for health insurance by $4.6 million, but that's obviously lower than the original number at $6.7 million increase. But still, it's an increase of $4.6 million, so it still represents a major driver of the board budget for next year. And one other sort of way to look at this and to put this in perspective is that based on these revised numbers, instead of a budget request of 220.1 million, the board budget would only need to be 218.1 million. So there's a $2.1 million reduction compared to our original request. And this $218.1 million represents an increase of 4.6% in the board operating budget. That, is obviously a number that, so at this point, we would say, or certainly I would say, based on the updated information from the district's health insurance consultant, the board can live with a reduced request of 218.1 million, or a 4.6% budget increase over current year. However, the CFO's recommended budget at about 212 million is 5.5 million less than the amount that's required based on our existing program and plans for next year's budget. So there is still a pretty wide gap between the board budget request, even as modified by this more favorable health insurance information, and what the CFO has recommended to the Board of Estimate and the Common Council.
Tom?
Yes.
The 3-year phase out of the previous health insurance fund, our last year of spend down on that, was that still at 1.1, or where did we land with that last year?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but
the health insurance fund that had been our self-insured fund,
yeah,
that we stepped down over 3 years. What was the step between what we are using in the current fiscal year and the 0 that will be next year?
2.7 million.
So we were starting behind already by 2.7 million.
Right. Yeah.
And then we added this additional 4.6 million of need.
No, the total need is 4.6 million. So,
Okay.
if I go this spreadsheet here, and I don't need to review this, I just put it in the presentation. So you had this is the original calculation of the amount that we needed to budget for health insurance, which is the 32.5 million for next year, which is an increase over the adopted budget for 2021 of 6.6 or 6.7 million. The revised numbers, and these are revised based on the updated information from the health insurance consultant, dropping in the 4% increase for active employees, plus the 12% increase for retirees, plus the increase last year to this year of any additional health insurance contracts that we have, in other words, employees who've taken health insurance, and the sort of top line number for the state partnership plan is going up by 2.8 million, or 7.8%. But still, when you drop to the bottom line, which is here, the total budget that we need to build into our general fund for next year is 30,452,000, which is this increase of $4.6 million, or just under 18%, compared to the 25.8 million that was budgeted in the current year. And so that's driven by several factors, one of the largest of which is this $2.7 million drawdown of fund balance that's not available next year.
Can I ask a question? The aids that we are using in order to split the class size at the elementary level, are they included in this number? And are we anticipating that we'll still need them moving into next fiscal year?
We have taken them out. We've assumed that those are not going to continue next year. If they do, we would hope that there is a continuation of some federal funding available to cover that cost.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions on health insurance? Okay, I'll go on. So now to sort of take a look at the CFO's budget presentation and talk about some of those areas where we think there are some inaccuracies in the information that was presented, or in some cases, we feel that there's information that perhaps is not complete or may be misleading.
Tom, sorry to interrupt. I apologize. I do have one question. It's sort of, it may be better for the city CFO, but regarding the insurance, do we know, we've gotten some updated numbers that have an impact on our budget assumptions for next year. Do we know what the impact, since the city uses the same insurance provider, what the impact is on the city side? Or maybe we can ask that tomorrow at the joint meeting?
Yeah, I think it would be good to ask that. If I understood correctly, the question I believe was asked at the council meeting last night, and I believe that I heard Mr. Dakowitz indicate that there was something on the order of a $700,000 favorable result or favorable budget variance for the city. They had assumed a slightly lower or somewhat lower increase in the budget that they put out. But there is still some savings based on what Mr. Dakowitz indicated. But it's probably best for him to answer that question because I don't have direct access to that information.
Okay, we'll bring it up tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So again, as I've indicated, we think that we need to make some response, and this is really our initial take at, where we feel the CFO's presentation perhaps does not, state all the facts as sort of transparently as we might like. So we look at this and we think the bottom line recommendation really is that the CFO has recommended a city budget increase of 6.1%. And he's recommended a Board of Education increase at 2.0%. And frankly, I think that some of the facts that we heard in Mr. Dakowitz's presentation on Monday and yesterday were really designed to support a budget recommendation that provides a municipal budget increase that is recommended at 3 times the rate of increase that's been recommended for education. And so we think that some facts have sort of been cherry picked, and there's been decisions to present information or exclude information in order to provide a narrative, if you will, that attempts to justify why the Board of Education increase should be limited to 2%, while the city side is going up at 6.1%. And we do think that some of the information that was presented is misleading or is not complete, and that there are some cases where the information is inaccurate. And we think that there have been really faulty conclusions that have been drawn in some cases based on straw man arguments. And so I've got a number of slides here that I want to go through that help sort of elaborate and explain our thinking on this. So one of the areas that Mr. Dakowitz spent quite a bit of time talking about was in the area of Board of Education staffing and enrollment. And we believe that there is, first and foremost, a major flaw in the CFO's Board of Education staffing analysis. And you may recall that Mr. Dakowitz indicated that Board of Education staffing had increased by 292 positions, I believe is what he had indicated, over I think it was a 3-year or 2 or 3 year period.
2-year period,
A 2-year.
2018-19 through 2021.
And essentially, what we found in looking at this further was that Mr. Dakowitz was really comparing apples to oranges. And the issue is this: the recent year figures that Mr. Dakowitz was citing represented total FTEs, or full-time equivalent counts. And the original year that Mr. Dakowitz was citing, going back to 2018-19 and before, he was citing numbers using an earlier city convention on staff reporting, and that the city's convention in the city budget book, as well as in the official statement, which is the bond document, the bond offering document that is prepared by the city in advance of issuing debt, that the city's convention was to report full-time employees. And the city's budget document had defined full-time employees as a 0.8 full-time equivalent, or 0.8 FTE or higher. And total FTEs, on the other hand, counts all employees, even those employees who work less than a 0.8. Now, on the city side of the organization, this is not a terribly important distinction. But on the Board of Ed side of the and the reason it's not a very important distinction is the city does not have very many employees who are part-time employees or employees who work less than a 0.8. The Board of Education, on the other hand, has a substantial number of employees who work less than 0.8. In fact, you're well aware we have many NFEP employees, paraprofessionals, who are scheduled to work 27 and a half hours a week. And an employee who works 27 and a half hours a week is scheduled as a 0.73 FTE. So the point is that the numbers that Mr. Dakowitz was using to calculate an increase of 292 positions was counting in the early years only the people who were 0.8 and above, and yet in the latter years he was counting total FTEs. So that is, what I would say is essentially an error in that presentation. That in fact the increase in employee counts at the Board of Education is not 292 employees. Kristen has been feverishly working to validate these numbers. We're reluctant to put out final numbers until we're sure that they're accurate and that we've tested them and made sure they're accurate. We believe the number is approximately over this time period 96 additional employees, or 96 additional FTEs, not 292 FTEs. So the CFO has really inaccurately reported inflated BOE position growth over the past 3 years.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Dr. Estrella and Mr. Hamilton, did Mr. Dakowitz or any member of the mayor's staff reach out to you to discuss this number and clarify their data before they inserted it into their report?
No. No, we didn't get that sort of inquiry.
So that's the second year in a row that this particular individual has gone public with something without even vetting his facts. Thank you.
So the other sort of broader issue here is my last bullet point on this slide, and that is the implication of the presentation that I heard from Mr. Dakowitz, and the conclusion that he seems to be drawing is that higher Board of Ed staffing levels equal or equate a less efficient organization, an organization. So the implication seems to be if staffing levels have gone up, by definition, that means the Board of Education is being less efficient. And frankly, we reject that notion, and we reject that position as being really simplistic and based on faulty logic. And I've got a number of slides that will delve into a little more depth, because we certainly do acknowledge that even though Mr. Dakowitz's number of 292 additional positions is inaccurate, we have added staff members over the last several years. However, our position is that the addition of these staff members has in fact made the Board of Education more efficient and more effective, that the addition of these staff members has in fact saved the taxpayers of Norwalk money. So if we look at special education, and I'm glad that our Chief of Specialized Learning has joined us, Yvette Garbage. Thank you for joining us, Yvette. So if there are questions on the next several slides, she can certainly help answer any questions or add to the presentation here. So this slide here is a multi-year history of the total number of special education students that we are serving in the district. And so I think a couple important takeaways here. One, there has been an increase since 2015-16 in the total number of special education students, although it has leveled off essentially over the last 2 or 3 years. There's been an increase. Number two, these numbers based on, you know from the recent special education report that the district, I believe we're at 14% of our students are identified as special education, and that is very consistent with statewide and national numbers, that we are not over-identifying students, that there is, that these numbers are, where you would expect them to be in terms of total student counts. I don't know if there's anything else on that slide, Yvette, that you would.
I do want to say that the leveling off this year, I anticipate, is an artificial impact of COVID. I know several, for example, kindergarten families that have decided to wait the year in COVID and will be registering next year. So I do anticipate a slight bump in that number that we should be prepared for in 21, 22. That the current year, I believe, is an artificial flattening due to all the issues we know regarding COVID.
So I guess this, unfortunately, this slide I did not get, it's not 13, it's 137. I corrected it on an earlier version, but it didn't come through in this final version. So it was, the correct numbers, I believe, are 137. Do you remember the 16, 17? Is that 100 and,
if you expand the numbers, Tom, if you can expand the numbers.
Yeah, I don't think I can do it in the presentation.
It went from 137 down to 118, down to a 91. You need to go back. Yeah. And we are at what I believe is a sweet spot in terms of where we are now. Members of this committee and anyone listening will know that the purpose of the special ed redesign was to deliver these results to allow us to establish internal capacity to serve our students in the schools that they would typically attend with their siblings and their friends and their neighbors. And that has happened. And again, there are children who are so profoundly involved or so unusually impacted by their disabilities that we may not be able to safely and effectively serve them. But as you can see, there has been a huge decrease, and we anticipate with the continued support around the programs that have been developed and now ready for implementation with Fidelity, you will continue to see these costs and the out-of-district count remain consistent. Not only is it cost effective, but it's appropriate for kids. And I think that's the most important message I want to leave with anyone who's looking at the dollars and cents of special education. It's appropriate, it is best, and it is cost effective.
And I think that's precisely the point on this, is that this really meets multiple objectives. To reduce the number of outplaced students from 137 to 66 over this time period is really, you know, an amazing accomplishment. And it was certainly understood from day one, and certainly should have been expected, and I think was expected, that in order to build these programs in-house and to bring students back in district, of course we were going to be adding staff. Of course we have to add staff. That's a given, that if we hadn't added staff, we would not have reduced the number of outplaced students, and we would still have this 137 students outplaced at I think, I'm not sure if you know off the top of your head, Yvette, what the average cost of an outplacement is, but I know, it's certainly in the six figures, and I think some of them are well into six figures.
Depending upon how severely impacted the student is, the average cost ranges from $70,000 to upwards of $250,000, plus the cost of related services and the cost of transportation. Remember, we're putting kids on buses to go a half hour or an hour out of their home community. So there's that additional cost of transportation as well.
Right.
And I would also potentially add the cost of litigation if we don't offer our services per IEP in compliance.
I have an interesting slide that speaks to that, Barbara, that I think Tom is going to show you next.
So the next one is the parent placement. You want to talk about this as well, Yvette?
Well, that's exactly Barbara's point. So at the time, you see, over the past 6 years, in addition to the program development that allowed us to welcome students back into the community, we also see a steady decline. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion about this in recent weeks. There has been a steady decline in issues related to litigation and complaints that forced agreements because the district could not defend its IEP or its program implementation. I would love to live in a world where we never needed any agreements. And if anyone knows where that world exists, please let me know. But reducing the number of agreements down to this number is again testimony to the work of our staff in developing appropriate IEPs that are appropriate for the student and defensible in light of our multiple requirements of IDEA and state regulations. So when you put both the decrease in the out-of-district placements and you align it with the decrease in the agreements that represent litigation or complaints, you see the trend is going significantly in the right direction for the district in terms of its services, in special education.
Thank you, Yvette. So the other area where we've experienced really extraordinary budget savings is in contracted professional services. You can see in 2016-17 in special education, the Special Education Department spent over $7.3 million on contracted services out of local funds. And this is for, speech and language pathologists. This is for BCBAs. This was for a whole, series of staff members or contracted folks who were providing services to the district. And that figure has been reduced down to 1.1 million in the budget for 21-22. And so, this is really an enormous budget savings to the district. But obviously, there's been staff. Yes, there have absolutely. We have had to, hire staff. We've hired staff to perform these services rather than contract them out at much higher cost. And so, that isn't a cause to criticize the district for hiring staff when in fact, it's more cost effective and more efficacious for the services we provide to be providing them in-house.
Can I just add in there for a minute from a special education parent perspective? When we use our own employees who are stable within the district, we can also provide better continuity of services to our families. It takes a while to build a relationship with the service provider and to have trust, because trust is a big part of what needs to happen in that area. So this is actually a great leap forward for us to have that capacity in district, because it has enabled us to have better relationships with the families of our special needs students.
And I do want to point out, in 2016-17, you see that artificial bump. You may recall that was the first year of the district's funding for the special ed redesign. That was prior to my coming into the district, but at that point there was a very targeted focus on contracting with providers that would provide services in school, so in our public schools. So we had a $2 million contract with an agency for BCBA and ABA services. You'll see that was eliminated 2 years later. That's the big dip in the purple, because we hired BCBAs and set upon the training path that many of you know about to create 54 RBTs, or paras. Now, that was an increase, but this was our internal staff. And if you do the cost analysis, not only is it cost effective, but as Barbara indicated, it creates the long-term ability to serve children over time, and not just this child, but the next child as well. So we've built that internal capacity. We now need to focus on implementation with fidelity, but the shifts have happened. And in future slides, Tom, we did a comparison of staff increase to a decrease in other areas.
Right. So the next slide is special education teachers from 2015-16 to 2021. And in fact, as you would expect, because we were building programs in-house and replacing contracted services with in-house staff and bringing students who were outplaced back in district, of course, there's been an increase in the number of special education teachers. And so that's what you see here. But again, that's not an evidence, or that's not evidence of inefficiency on the part of the district. That's evidence of the district doing the right thing and building these services in-house and saving taxpayers money at the same time.
And in fact, Tom, it was what City Council and the BET charged the Board of Education to do beginning in 2016-17 with their $3.6 million investment beyond what the general fund requested in those years.
That's correct. And just to finish up special ed, I think we've got a couple, this slide puts together the reduction in contracted services with the change in teacher counts. And you see they really coincide very, directly. And that really is the explanation for the increase in staffing in the special education department. And I think the last one is similar, but looks at out-of-district students. And again, same thing, as we've reduced the number of students who are outplaced, we've increased the staffing because we have to serve those students in district.
And I think what you see in these two slides is an inverse relationship to build efficiency within the system. So what the district has done is very strategically build capacity within the system to provide adequate services to our students and provide the continuum of services in-house, and inversely reduce the cost associated with either outsourcing or outplacing students. Because when we have to outplace, the amount of cost associated with it is much higher than that when we provide services within the system.
And I think, the other thing that this sort of points out is that in order to really understand what's going on and to understand and to draw valid conclusions about efficiency, you really have to look a lot deeper than we saw the city CFO do in his presentation. Just looking at changes in staffing levels over a period of time without understanding the context behind it is really sort of meaningless information. And so we think this provides the kind of context that you need to have in order to understand the Board of Ed staffing changes. I think next we look at multilingual learners, and we have a few slides on multilingual learners. It's not a new news. Well that the number of multilingual learners in Norwalk has been increasing. And in particular, we had a very large increase in 2019-20. And as a result of that, we did seek a special appropriation from the city, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. This slide does show that there was a slight dip this year, and we attribute that essentially entirely to COVID. Obviously, we're in an unprecedented situation with a global pandemic, and the movement of people really around the globe has been drastically impacted. And so, we have seen a slight dip. And again, we don't think that's really a material dip, although what we added here was the current figures as of today. You can see these numbers are all as of October 1st, except for the last number, which is a current number as of today. And you can see as of today, the number has been rising since October. And so we do believe that is likely, as the pandemic, hopefully later this year, starts to really wane as a result of widespread vaccine deployment. We would expect to see this number start to return to continued growth. And so that has been certainly a factor that the school system has needed to respond to. And again, one of those responses was through the request for a special appropriation and the need to increase staffing in our multilingual learner department. And so what this slide here shows is certified and non-certified FTEs that are working in this department. And you can see particularly in the last several years, the last 3 years, the last 2 years really, there has been a pretty substantial increase in staffing, and that's necessary to meet our enrollment growth there and to meet the needs of our students. And so again, we think there's a very valid and appropriate explanation for the staffing growth in the multilingual learner department, because we have more students that need to be educated. We're in the business of providing all of our students with an appropriate and high quality education. And so that means we need to have the staff in place available to do that.
And can I just add, both of the areas that you've highlighted so far are legally mandated. They're not something at our discretion. We must do these things, special education and multilingual learning. So I'm not sure how we do our jobs without that staff increase.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid and legitimate point, is we're required to perform these services. And so,
sorry,
yes.
Go ahead, Don.
No, go ahead, Colin.
I wanted to add to that too, that I think that sometimes people do think of these services as siloed or in a vacuum, and they may say, well, we have to provide these multilingual learning opportunities because of policies that attract multi-language families to Norwalk. And they think of these as like, okay, well, if we don't cater to them, they won't come. And it's, first of all, a very flawed argument for so many reasons, but it's short-sighted, because I don't think people realize that if we do not have the resources to properly provide instruction for our multilanguage learners and our special education learners, that's going to impact the entire student population. It's going to stretch all the resources we have. And if somebody thinks that adding resources to properly service all our students is somehow unfair to students who are not part of these populations, I think it's very important to note that it's actually fair to all our students to make sure that we have the resources to deliver the instruction. If we didn't have these multi-language learners resources, our entire student population would suffer.
Yep, and I think that's absolutely spot on. I think the reality is we have both a moral and a legal obligation to serve the needs of our students and to provide them the services that they need in order to become productive and members of society and well-educated adults who are ready after they leave and graduate from Norwalk to move on to college or career and to really thrive and flourish in the world. That's our obligation. That's our responsibility. That's what we're in business for. And we can't pick certain students and say we don't think these students are deserving of that effort. I mean, we have to serve all of the students who are here that are in our schools. So
I think I'd like to add, I think one of the things that was most attracting to come to work in Norwalk was the diversity that existed within our community. And we celebrate that. And in celebrating that, we also have to understand that we have to provide adequate resources to enrich the diversity that we have. When we think about special education students and the mandates associated with it, it's not a cookie cutter formula. And sometimes when people don't understand policy and understand the services around the educational spectrum, they fail to realize that it's not just a easy formula to identify what is needed for the different student populations. There's a lot of complexity involved in designing a program for exceptional learners, in the same way that there's complexity in gifted and talented, that there's complexity around serving multilingual learners. And when we put ourselves in a situation where we're creating one formula for all, we create a false narrative in terms of what students need and how services are provided within the system. And I think it's very important, as people are crunching numbers, to remember that we're talking about people, that we're in the business of serving children, that we're in the business of serving people, children that have diverse interests, diverse styles of learning, diverse approaches of engaging in the learning experience, and that we have a moral responsibility as a society, as a community, to allow the education system to provide those services in the way that fits best for the child and their families. And creating a narrative where we're saying that we have a 7.85 to 1 ratio creates a false perspective in how classrooms are structured, not only through the contractual obligation, but policies and other facets that are essential in formulating what the classroom looks like. Right? When you look at special education services, you have kids that are in classrooms of diverse ratios and proportions. You go into a multilingual classroom, it's the same thing. You go into gifted and talented, you have similar scenarios. You go into a general education classroom, you might have to change proportions, ratios as well, depending on the needs of that particular student population. So I just have to preface that, because as we look at the numbers and we look at how we have created programs in-house and we have modified programming within the system, we have to understand that efficiency within a school system is not defined by numbers. It's defined by the policies associated with certain programs that we need to provide, but most importantly, they're associated with people and what we need to do for children, because children are people. And I think sometimes we forget that when we engage in these conversations. So I hope, as we continue to engage in this narrative of the resources that we need, that we keep that at the forefront of our conversation. And I think the last piece is understanding that we also have unfunded mandates that are set policies by the federal government and the state. And despite the fact that they're unfunded mandates, we have a responsibility to ensure that we provide those services as per state statute and sometimes federal statute. And that builds in the complexity of the work that we have to do. And I think I need to preface that, because I think sometimes we forget that we're bound by certain guidelines that we have to address, but most importantly, we're in the service of people. And when we're in the service of people, there's no cookie cutter approach in doing the work. That's why when our teachers come into the classroom, they're looking for an array of different and diverse ways in which they want to approach the lesson, because not every individual in that room acquires knowledge in the same way. And I think that when we talk about the budget, we create this cookie cutter formula sometimes without thinking about all these other facets that are involved in the development of the work that Tom, in collaboration with the rest of the board and the cabinet, engage in to make sure that we're doing what's best for children. So I just needed to preface that as we continue this conversation, because sometimes we get lost in the numbers and forget what we're really doing here. We're servicing families and children.
I'd like to say too that I have to say that these slides and everything that you're presenting tonight is going to explain a lot to the public and hopefully to the city, to see that, you guys are trying very, very hard, and it's all about the children and the ways that you've been saving funds. Yes, staff has been increasing, funds have been decreasing, but it's all about the children. I love the passion that Dr. Estrella brings in, because she thinks of all the children in every way, shape, or form. Any type of classroom, any type of learning, disability, program, and we do lose sight of the children. And I think that's where we're running into problems right now, because the city side is looking at just numbers. They're not looking at the details. They're misinformed. They don't understand. We're not communicating well with each other and not understanding each other. And I'm hoping that with these slides and the explanation, that they do take it to heart and they do see that we need to do what we need to do for the children. You know, by law, it's our responsibility. They're our future. We can't just let numbers create, you know, decisions that are not right. And we have to try our hardest and, you know, come to the table and sit and talk, and not sit here and decide that this number is too big or that number is too big and this classroom is too big and the staff is too big, benefits are too high. It's not about that. There's a bigger picture there. It's about every single child in Norwalk that lives in Norwalk, that comes out of district, that comes from other countries. It's about educating children. And I want to say thank you to Dr. Stray and her team, because you guys have been working really, really hard, the number of hours, and putting all of this together to be able to educate everyone of all the work that goes into this. It's not just a number thrown in the air. It's studies, it's stats, it's everything. But thank you for all of this, and I look forward to see what else comes up.
Okay, thank you. You know, I think all of those comments really help drive home, you know, what we're all here for, which is the kids and our students and serving our students. And I do think sometimes, you know, in these discussions, budget discussions, we tend to lose sight of that. So thank you for all for, you know, reminding us of that. So back to numbers. This slide is simply just to remind people that when we did go to the city and ask for a special appropriation to meet, you know, the needs of our students, and the city did, you know, grant us an appropriation at that time of $1 million. Associated with that $1 million, and this was all, you know, this came directly from the presentation that we provided to the city. There were 21 FTEs associated with that additional cost, and the total program cost was estimated for a full year at $1.9 million. So, you know, so that again, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that our FTE count has gone up over this time period. When, you know, we know that this was one of the driving factors. This is one of the needs of our students. The city, you know, looked at this, examined this, and agreed with this, and then provided a special appropriation. So it shouldn't come as this was never pitched as being a one-time expense that just sort of miraculously went away. It was understood from the beginning that this was going to be an ongoing expense to the district, and that these staff members were needed in order to continue to run these programs. And the third area we want to just highlight is the area of high school graduation credit requirements, and remind people that one of the things we sort of came to realize was we understood that historically high school students in Norwalk were scheduled for an excessive number of study halls. And in some cases, we had students who were scheduled for 2, and even in some cases 3 study halls per day, because we had run out of teachers available to teach them. There were no spaces left in classes for those students to sign up for. And so these students were being put into study halls. And, you know, that was really viewed at the time as really an intolerable situation, and one that had to be corrected. And so the board, you know, very diligently designed a multi-year plan to add staffing at the high schools so that we could ameliorate that situation. At the same time, we looked and the highest performing districts in the state long had a 26 credit graduation requirement. And this is the superintendent referred to unfunded mandates. This was a case where the state determined that statewide that schools should be moving toward a 26 credit graduation requirement. And again, the best performing school districts in the state already had implemented this requirement. And so the district moved forward and implemented a 26 credit graduation requirement. And that, of course, that combined with the fact that, we felt it was really intolerable to have students sitting in study halls when they needed to be in classes, and we needed to, improve the rigor of the high school program so that over a 3-year period, there were 29 high school teachers that were added as part of that initiative. And so again, we consider ensuring that our public school students graduate college and career ready. We really consider that a sacred responsibility to our children. And I know that Mr. Dakowitz made reference to the law of diminishing returns in his presentation. And, I would, humbly suggest that, the law of diminishing returns could be carried to, such an extreme where, somebody may look at that and say, gee, if somebody gets to an 8th grade education level, that's good enough. That's good enough for us. And we don't need to, get anyone beyond that level that we're, now experiencing diminishing returns on our investment. And frankly, that's just ludicrous. Frankly, our students deserve all of the educational opportunities that we can provide them. Our students deserve the opportunity to, become the best and most productive and most successful high functioning adult that they can become. And that's what our responsibility is.
And I want to preface the fact that a community prospers by the success of their children and future generations.
Mhm.
So the investment that we're making today will pay off tenfold in the future. If we don't make an investment to educate our children, then we're not setting the next generation of Norwalkers to be successful. And we want to make sure that we make every concerted effort that the people that will continue to excel and move this community forward are well educated and can bring in revenue from the resources and education that they acquire back into our community. I also want to preface that a great school system also creates better property value and as a result, additional resources for the community. Because sometimes we disconnect that element of what we do to the impact of what happens community-wide. And I think it's very important to preface that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Estrella. So this slide, I don't need to go into the details, but this is, again, information that was shared at the time we were implementing the increased high school graduation requirements and the additional staffing associated with that. So in terms of the enrollment analysis, the city CFO did provide some comments on district enrollment. And, I think at least part of those comments, I would suggest he seemed to be implying that the district was, inflating our enrollment projections, and we reject that notion. We, is absolutely, inaccurate and faulty to come to that conclusion. I'd point out that the portion of the CFO's enrollment analysis where he talks about total FTEs compared to students, it suffers from the same critical flaw as the staffing analysis, because his staffing numbers were not apples to apples, and therefore his, ratios that he was deriving were inaccurate. But I think the broader point is really that sort of analysis is really very rudimentary and not particularly insightful or illuminating about what's going on in the school system. Even if the numbers were accurate, even if you had accurate staffing numbers, I don't think that looking at your total FTE counts, compared to your number of students, is all that useful, because it really requires, as we've been discussing, that you dig behind the numbers a lot more deeply than that to understand what those numbers mean. So I think really that measure is really simplistic and is not, it's maybe one data point, but it's really not a particularly useful or relevant data point in my judgment. I also want to, remind everyone that the district uses professional outside demographers who update our enrollment projections every year. So these are not numbers that we just sort of pull out of a hat. These are numbers that are developed based on, really the best, demographic analysis that's, available. And we use the numbers that our demographer recommends. Now, this is always never an exact science. There are always so many factors that go into enrollment that are constantly moving and constantly in flux, that no matter what, the numbers are never going to be, exactly spot on every year. It's just unrealistic to expect that. They are really have to be looked at as a sort of a range of numbers. And, particularly the further out you go, the wider that range is likely to be. But even the 1-year enrollment numbers are impacted by, changes in the economy and changes in, a whole variety of factors. And the analysis that Mr. Dakowitz presented last night identified that in particular in 2020-21, that the actual enrollments were quite a bit lower than the budget enrollment. I think it was 400 some odd students lower than the budgeted enrollments based on the October 1 enrollments. And I don't know whether, this is a surprise to Mr. Dakowitz, but we've been in the middle of a global pandemic for the last, almost the last year, the last 9 months. And COVID-19 has obviously upended the world and has changed everything about the way things work. And so the fact that in 2020-21, that our enrollment numbers would be off compared to budget, compared to the projections that were put together in, I guess probably December before COVID hit, it is not at all surprising. And it's not, something that, that anyone could have predicted. So to me, I think in fact that our enrollment numbers have historically come in quite close to the projections, with the exception of 2021, which is really explained entirely by COVID. I mean, in terms of the impact on enrollment for COVID, just probably half of the numbers, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a very large portion of the students that didn't arrive this year were kindergarten students, and parents obviously have decided to hold their kids out for a year and said, we're gonna, hold off. And that's a very understandable reaction of a parent with a 5-year-old. And, it doesn't mean those students have disappeared. It means we're probably going to see them next year, and we're going to have very large kindergarten classes, you know, very large kindergarten cohort next year, I suspect. You know, so again, obviously we don't know how COVID is going to play out over the course of the next, you know, 6 months or into next school year. We're all hoping that it really starts to get behind us. But again, I think that really explains what happened in 2021. So the operations and efficiency study was also referenced in Mr. Dakowitz's presentation. So we wanted to just touch upon that issue. You know, we do have, you know, a little bit of a difference of opinion with the position that Mr. Dakowitz presented in his presentation. We note a couple of points here. First, there certainly were discussions last spring about moving forward with a operations and efficiency study, and the former superintendent and I believe the board did agree that they, you know, that was something that the board would participate in. But there were a couple important points here. First, the RFP was developed and advertised, put out on the street without any involvement or knowledge by the Board of Education. We were not invited to help craft the RFP, to define the scope of services, to participate in any discussions about how those responses would be vetted and reviewed. We received you know, notice, as I recall, it was in late September or early October. I got an email, and I believe that Mr. Houston got an email inviting us to participate on a panel to review the responses and to interview finalists. We were invited into that, you know, process really rather late in the game. We were 2 representatives out of, I don't know, Colin, was it 6 or 8 people? I'm not sure, but there
were 6.
Six
Yeah.
people. So there were 4 representatives on the city and 2 of us on the Board of Education side. And so I'm suggesting here that the Board of Education was really not positioned as a co-equal partner in this engagement. And so the superintendent, I think rightfully asked to the city to go back and to reset that arrangement. It's my understanding that there's been some sort of memorandum that is presently now in the city's court, and you know, we're expecting that there is going to be a study that's going to go forward, but it's important that the Board of Education be considered really a co-partner in this engagement, that we are, you know, not a city department directly, we are a co-partner in the engagement. And there also needs to be a clear understanding of what the study is and is not. The study is not intended, and we do not believe it should involve the district's educational program. That really is a responsibility that rests solely with the Board of Education. So we did want to respond to that because there was some implication, I think, from Mr. Dakowitz's presentation that the Board of Ed had, you know, somehow been seeking to, you know, delay this or to not, you know, cooperate in it, and that's not the case. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add anything on this.
Yeah, I do want to add something separate that really troubled me. Mr. Dakowitz also suggested in the December 7th Board of Estimate and Taxation meeting to consider using the consultants that did this audit to help to prioritize our capital work. which is not their role and was not part of the scope of the RFP. So I think he has very ambitious ideas as to what this joint audit might be.
And I just want to add, Barbara, in perspectives to the facilities component, we have a facility study on its way, which will inform us in a really robust way in terms of what are the capital improvement projects that need to be prioritized for the next few years, as well as overall maintenance and upkeep of our facility, of our facilities throughout the next 5 to 10 years. So that is not part of necessarily the conversations of what the RFP in collaboration with the city will encompass. But most importantly, it appeared yesterday that the study was focused on the educational program versus the items that were articulated previously. So I think that that piece needs to be clearly clarified, because we don't want any confusion.
Okay, so unless there's any other comments on the operations and efficiency study, I'll move to the last slide. And I've put together just a couple of additional talking points here, and we're still doing more work on this, and I want to validate some of the numbers, but generally I don't take any exception to the inclusion of Board of Ed in-kind services in terms of trying to calculate the total percentage that the Board of Education makes up of the overall city budget. So in-kind services, what we're talking about here are things like the Parks and Recreation Department, which provides maintenance services to all of the school fields, and they provide maintenance to the playgrounds that are located on school property. The police department provides school resource officers and provides school crossing guards at key locations. The law department, the city law department, provides some services to the Board of Education on occasion. The city controller's office provides services to the Board of Education in terms of accounts payable functions and payroll functions and other accounting functions. So there's a number of areas where, in fact, the city does provide services to the Board of Education. But I do think it is, and those services get reported on something called the in-kind services report. And so when we file what's known as the EFS filing, it's a financial filing with the State Department of Education each year, we incorporate those in-kind services that the city reports to us, so that, and the intention is so that you can then compare apples to apples from one school district to another, because it varies from city to city and school district to school district who does what. In some school districts, it may be the school district that takes care of the fields, whereas here in Norwalk, the city takes care of the fields. So the intention of this in-kind services report is to allow more accurate cross-district comparisons on per pupil spending. But I do think I've made one point here, and that is beneficiaries of these services do extend beyond the Board of Education. So the fields are used extensively by users outside of direct Board of Education users. There's all kinds of athletic leagues and others that make use of those fields. Playgrounds obviously are used not only during school hours while students are in school, but parents take their children to playgrounds all the time on school locations. So, I do think there is certainly some spillover benefit that would need to be at least acknowledged, that this is not just a exclusively Board of Education benefit. But overall, I don't have any problem with the notion of building in the in-kind services and capturing that and acknowledging that that there are expenses in the city budget that do provide service to the Board of Education. And with respect to debt service as well, I don't object to capturing the cost of debt service on Board of Education projects and providing information to decision makers and the public about how much of the city's debt service is related to Board of Education projects and how much is related to city projects. The one thing I'd note about the data that Mr. Dakowitz did present is that actually, if you look at these debt service numbers, over the last 7 years, debt service, the portion of city debt service that is attributable to the Board of Education has actually been remarkably stable. I'm looking for the number now. Yeah, so in 2014-15, I guess 7 years ago, debt service attributable to the Board of Education was 14.4 million. In the current year, it's 14.9 million. Next year, he's projecting it at 15.1 million. So it's gone up, through this year from 2014 to 2021 by about $500,000, or I think it's a little over 3% increase over that rather extended period of time. So I do think it's worth noting that, in fact, debt service over the last 7 years related to the Board of Education has not been a driver of the city budget in any way. And if there's been increases in debt service, those increases really have been attributable primarily to increases in the city portion of debt service. The other point that I do want to make is that when Mr. Dakowitz, added in-kind and services and debt service, he's calculating that in the current year, the percentage was 61.4% of the entire city budget. Couple of points to note. One is next year, based on his budget recommendation, because he has recommended a significantly larger increase in the city side of the budget compared to the Board of Ed side of the budget, the overall percentage of the budget attributable to the Board of Education is going down. It's going down from 61.4 to 60.3% under the CFO's recommendation. The other thing I'd note, and I still want to do a little more research here to get current data, but I know from having looked at this information in the past that a percentage of 60% is not out of line in any way, shape, or form with where most municipalities are in Connecticut. In fact, if you go to the suburban municipalities, which I intend to do, but in my recollection is that, if you go to the more suburban communities, a Westport or a New Canaan or a Darien or a Wilton, my guess is you're going to see that percentage up closer to 65%. It may even be up near 70%.
Is that something we could reach out to CCM to clarify best practice? Because I remember last year or 2 years ago, Dr. Adamowski said he's worked all over the state, very aware of the terrain in our state. And he said it was between 60 and 80%. So I'd be interested to get, documented numbers from CCM or some other legitimate source.
Yeah, we can certainly see what they can give us. I think one of the wrinkles will be making sure we have the in-kind and debt service numbers in there so that we're comparing apples to apples. But, I do know we've looked at it in the past with respect to Stamford, and my recollection from a few years ago is we were very close to Stamford as well. So we'll get updated figures and look at that. But again, being at 60 or 61% is certainly not an unusual place to be. It's quite typical.
And I had reached out to the School and State Finance Project, and unfortunately they didn't have an answer, but they said that CCM would be the place to ask.
Okay, and then I've made this point a few times, but again, the and this is really just my last three bullets are really concluding comments, if you will. But again, the CFO's budget recommendation provides for a 6.1% city budget increase and a 2% Board of Education increase. So essentially, we have what is I would consider a disproportionate 3 times relationship here, where essentially this recommendation is reallocating resources away from education. And the CFO's recommendation of a $4.2 million increase does not fund the contractual increases of our labor contracts, nor does it even fund the revised $4.6 million increase necessary for health insurance. So unfortunately, the clear implication of that is it will necessitate cuts to current services. And, that would obviously be, troubling and unfortunate if that is where we end up. What I have suggested here is that based on the revised health insurance number that we just received this week, a 4.6% budget increase, so a full 1 percentage point less than the 5.6% that we originally requested, but a 4.6% increase at this point, which again, still less than the 6.1% budget increase, will fund all of the essential Board of Education programs and avoid the need to make painful program cuts. So, that certainly would be, an outcome that I, could get behind and would hope that perhaps there'll be an opportunity to convince those on the city side to reconsider or to consider something, greater than the 2% that Mr. Dakowitz has recommended. And again, a 4.6% number, I think would be, quite appropriate. So that concludes the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, but obviously there's opportunity for further questions.
So just to be clear, in the accounting of headcount, we're excluding the things that are on the COVID grant.
Kristen, you're muted. We're excluding
Correct.
for next year, right? We've excluded COVID headcount in next year's budget.
But I just want to verify, have we also, in responding to Mr. Dakowitz, it's employee count. Did his numbers also include the people that we have had to use this year in order to reopen the schools safely during a pandemic?
No, his numbers do not reflect that.
Okay.
I think really the issue was what Tom had illustrated, that at a certain point in time, a few years ago, it was based on a 0.8 FTE and we had a change in methodology.
Yeah. Just wanted to make sure, because we hadn't talked about it explicitly.
Yep.
Tom, I know you've been busy working on our budget. Have you had a chance to look at the city's budget?
Not in any sort of detail at this point. We are, trying to, to look at that for tomorrow's joint finance committee meeting, but we have not gotten too far on that at this point. So we're still working on that.
I think it would be important. I was happy to see them lower their contingency fund, which has been somewhat inflated and always ended up getting rolled over into the general fund. So that's a positive development. But I do note a large growth in corporate counsel and some growth in DPW as well. And I was just curious if in the discussions there was any talk about what might be driving that on their side. Like I think we've got a good handle on what is driving our increases on our side. And in order to have an educated conversation, I feel like we don't know what's driving that on the other side yet.
Yeah,
But I guess we'll find out tomorrow.
I hope that Mr. Dakowitz will be able to shed some light on those issues tomorrow. One challenge we have, frankly, is, and I know that Mr. Dakowitz, indicated that the city budget director, has had some medical issue, and we obviously wish her full and speedy recovery. But normally the city budget, in fact, the city charter requires the finance director to transmit the budget to the Board of Estimate on Monday, this past Monday. And if I understood correctly, I don't think that budget has been transmitted. I have not seen it, and I haven't seen it posted on the city website. Usually it's posted on the city website. So I think there's been obviously some sort of delay in getting that budget finalized and prepared. And so unfortunately, we don't even have a budget document to look at to kind of see if we can figure those things out.
Agreed. I also was saddened to hear of Ms. Vogel's illness, and I'm sure we all join in sending her best wishes for a quick recovery. But we also do need to conduct the business of the city, and without these documents, it's very hard for us to do that.
Well, I will say that I think that it's useful to have the joint committee meeting tomorrow. And I know that many of us support doing more of these joint meetings. Yeah. And so, I think that's a great opportunity for us to, to sort of explore some of these budget recommendations more in more depth as a council committee and a board committee. And I do think it was very important and helpful to have this opportunity tonight to add some perspective and in some cases corrections to some of the statements made by the city CFO at the BET on Monday. And I think that in some cases, as Tom said, like for example, with the employee count, it was a matter of a change in the way that FTEs were accounted for. I don't want to assume the worst. I do think that what has happened is that those the statements he made in that presentation have now started to form a narrative, and we want to make sure that people understand the full scope of the narrative and not just the sort of bits and pieces that have been cherry picked as part of the existing budget presentation. So there's an opportunity tomorrow to sort of again see this from the full perspective, and I think I should clarify that I think that's what's most important for us here. We are fulfilling our chartered jobs, our chartered roles on the Board of Ed as stewards of the Norwalk Public School District. But we are also aware of the greater circumstances in which the city is preparing its budget. But we want to make sure that we are speaking in terms of fact and not, misrepresenting things that can then form certain narratives, whether intended or not.
And I think, we hope that with the advent of our vaccines, that we will return to some kind of normal someday this year, I hope, and that the economy also will stabilize. I'm very happy to see that at the state level, there is less bad news than some may have anticipated. And that's very helpful. And of course, at the federal level, many actions are being taken to help stabilize the economy nationally. So my hope is that we can continue to budget for a return to normalcy rather than an extended crisis stance, which would have us potentially losing programs that we have worked extremely hard to build to address the needs in our district. It would be a shame to have sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the historic moment that we're in and allow ourselves to lose track of the progress that we have already made and to maintain that.
You're here. But I do want to also reiterate our appreciation for the work that Dr. Estrella, that Tom, Kristen, and the entire team, Yvette, thanks for joining us tonight to share some again perspective. I think that it's very easy for some of the facts and figures to get lost in the public narrative, and I think it's very important for us to do our roles, which is to shed light with the actual data.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. I spent a few hours at the Norwalk Public Library History Room this week and went through about 2 decades of articles. And one of the things that really emerged is that everything old is new again, that we are repeating old conversations that happened in Norwalk for years, that is caused by structural tensions in the way that our city operates. And it is my hope that this iteration of our governmental bodies can have a transformational conversation that pushes us beyond Groundhog Day and beyond repeating conversations that happened in 2010 or 1969. So let's have that intentionality and hope that we can move forward without having to repeat history.
Thank you, Barbara. Anything else? Sorry, Dr. Estrella.
Diana wanted to say something.
Oh, go ahead, Diana.
I just wanted also to thank everyone for all the time and for the explanation, the detailed explanation that we needed a refresher and that the public and the city needed to hear. And also to keep in mind the expense that has been saved by Dr. Estrella and the team, during this COVID time, because this budget could have been really over the top, and they've done a phenomenal job keeping expenses down during this time. So I'm hoping that, we all keep in mind the children first, and we could all sit at the table and have a conversation. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Diana, for acknowledging that. I think, I don't think the work of any city organization right now, it's easy, right? There's a lot of challenges ahead. COVID has not made this process any easier for anyone. But I think our hope today is that we address some of the elements around the conversation that might have been lost in translation because of lack of clarity around what the work of the BOE is and how involved the work is. So I hope today you had an opportunity to have some light shed to some of the conversation. And we hope, like Diana said, that we can continue to work collaboratively to look at the path ahead, because we still have a long journey to move forward in as a result of COVID, but also just because we have a lot of work to do to continue to effectively support the community at large. And the mayor's work is not easy, our work is not easy, and the more we can do this together, the better we will be in doing what's right for the community at large.
So you do have a couple of other items on your agenda. You have some transfers, and there was the financial report. Given the our focus for the last couple of days on sort of preparing this presentation. We don't have a lot of commentary on the financial report, but we can certainly try to answer any questions you may have. And the transfers, I can bring them back up if we're finished with the discussion. I'll share my screen again with the transfers, and we can talk about those if that would be okay.
Thanks, Tom. Yes.
Let's see if I can find this. Let's see. Okay, so here it's a little, let's see, hold on. Can I, oh. Okay, so the transfers that you have on your agenda total 377,975. It looks like the first transfer is within the PONUS school budget, is to purchase some technology that's needed with funds coming from professional development within the PONUS budget. The second item.
We're actually going to purchase 65-inch ViewSonic boards for the classrooms to, with their goal of outfitting every class, with the moving towards the STEAM school.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if there's any questions on that item. If not, do you want to run through these, Kristen? If you're familiar with them, I don't want to put you on the spot. I did look at them a few days
Go ahead, Tom.
ago.
I'll just chime in if you have if I have
Okay.
extra comments.
So the next one is in Jefferson. I think this is just an account code issue. We have funding in one account org code, then it needs to be moved to a different org code to properly put the funds in the correct place. So that's really just an accounting adjustment. The next one is is a special education transfer. Actually, the next two transfers are special education transfers, which you've seen these kinds of transfers before. This is as a result of shifts in caseload. The staffing that we put together, in the budget obviously is developed, essentially 18 months before the fiscal year. And so changes in caseloads frequently mean that staff needs to move from one location to another. And so this is, accurately reflecting where this staff needs to be budgeted. I guess the other comment we've made in the explanation here is there's a sort of a very complicated dance we go through in terms of what positions are being paid for from local funding versus maybe paid for from grant funding. And we want to make sure we pay from local funding any expenses that might be eligible for excess cost reimbursement. And so that's another factor here, that if we have a particular student or students who are likely going to exceed the excess cost threshold, then we want to make sure we're paying for those services from local funds, because we can't claim excess cost for services that are paid for from grant funds. And after the two special education ones, there is a transfer within Norwalk High School, and this is transferring from a other professional services account to a teacher's line item, and this is to pay for tutoring services. This was a transfer request that Reginald Roberts submitted. The next two, the two $17,800 transfers are requests to essentially, there were some savings as a result of COVID in other professional service accounts, and Reginald has requested that we increase the budget so that he can pay to help students who need assistance to get them back on track, so that you know, these are credit recovery and to support students so that they you know, don't fail. And so we're trying to provide that additional support to students. And Reginald Roberts requested the transfer, and so we sent it through and indicated we could support that.
Can I ask a question on that? I'm sorry. That's a great idea that he has. And I'm just wondering, I know that our ESSER money that had to be used by December 31st, and that I assume the new funding that was approved in December may have a Jan 1 start time. Is any of this something that we could apply grant money to?
Possibly. We're looking at that. We did confirm that the coronavirus relief funding had to be spent by December 30th. So it wasn't, this isn't eligible under that program. Right. It would really be under the next round of ESSER funding that it would be potentially eligible. But we are, you know, still very much in the early stages of looking at, you know, what that funding can be used for, and how it would be best, you know, what the best uses of those funds would be.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just an interesting and intriguing possibility. If it's successful at Norwalk High, it might be great to look at whether we could do this in other buildings as well.
Yep, I think that's something we'll certainly be looking at. The next one is a special education transfer from out-of-district tuition to an other professional services account. And this is for some specialized services that are required in an IEP. And I don't know if Yvette's still on the call, but she can probably talk more about that. But it's a request to, you know, transfer funds to cover those specialized services that are required. And the next one is at the P-TECH school, and it is to cover teacher extracurricular activities and the costs associated with that coming from instructional equipment. And the last one is a Norwalk High transfer, which again is similar to the earlier ones we just discussed, but this is for non-certified staff in this case. So if there's no other questions, that concludes the transfers. And
do you want a motion to approve, Colin?
Yes, please.
So moved.
And do we have a second?
Aye.
All in favor of approving these budget transfers, say aye, raise your hand. I say 3, that's
Aye.
unanimous.
Aye.
Thank you so much.
And the last item is the January financial report. Again, I don't have any specific information to add at this point, but if there are any questions, we can certainly try to answer them and follow up if necessary.
Kristen, I see the supplies and materials is running low. Is that a timing thing, or is that because we have so many students who are remote?
I think it's a combination of cash flow and paying invoices, as well as digital learning. Potentially, maybe some of the supplies or workbooks may not have been needed because we're, you know, doing remote learning and have switched to some digital learning. So I think it's a combination.
Well, I also see that in several object codes, categories, we're running behind last year, and we're what is that, like $1 million behind, almost half $500,000 behind last year to date. And I only bring that up to ask or to have us consider whether we may start, if there's any chance to start anticipating a rollover.
Yep. That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
So we'll
Given
see.
where we are with the budget right now, I mean, do you think, Tom, that, or Kristen, like, is that something that is even? I mean, clearly we have a long way to go.
Right. It's I'm reluctant to,
Mhm.
suggest that at this point. I'm not saying it's impossible that may be the case, but we need to do more analysis and understand what else is kind of in the works. And typically, it's very hard to make these kind of projections until we get, quite close to the end of the fiscal year. Even in May, it can be very difficult to make, completely accurate projections. But to try to make them in, early February is pretty. I'm not saying that it's not worth the exercise, and I'm not saying that there, isn't a possibility that could, come to pass. But I don't, I can't sit here tonight and say confidently, yes, I think, there's an opportunity there.
That's absolutely fair. I just wanted to, kind of bring it up as to something to maybe start thinking about. But clearly we have a long way to go, and I hear you loud and clear. Okay. Any other questions on the January report?
Unemployment compensation. How is it looking? Is it better or worse than you thought it would look?
Well, let's see. Unemployment, I guess that's on the next page. So yeah, we're at 311,000. It's definitely running, well over our budget and what we had expected. But in the grand scheme of the district budget, I think we will be fine to be able to cover it. We did put in next year's budget. Do you remember, Kristen? Was it
250, I think?
No, it was more. I think it might have been was it 600,000 in next year's budget, I believe?
Go look.
I know we increased it pretty substantially, and so I think we seem to be on that kind of trajectory of six or maybe $700,000 here. But I think we'll. I'm looking at it now. It looks like 700,000.
Yeah, 700. We increased it potentially due to having to hire the paraprofessionals and potentially have them collect unemployment due to COVID. Right.
Yeah. So I think we're on track for that kind of number potentially this year as well. We'll see, but it may start to tail off later this year, and then but I don't know for certain.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, we certainly have an opportunity on Tuesday if anything comes up. And do we have to approve these?
No.
No, I don't think
Okay.
you have to take any action. I think it's really just for information.
Mhm.
Wonderful.
So we can read the tea leaves.
Well, thank you. And we did not get any public comments via email. And so I believe the next item on the agenda, I can have a motion for.
Aye.
Diana motions to adjourn, Barbara seconds, all in favor.
Aye.
Really, again, thank you so much for the clarity on some of those budget numbers tonight. I think it's very important for the public to understand the full story, not just part of it. And I look forward to the opportunity tomorrow night at the joint meeting to continue to ask questions and get some more clarity on this budget recommendation.
Great.
Thank
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Good
everybody.
night.
See
Good
you tomorrow
night.
night.
See you tomorrow.
Stay warm.